Gary Graham. On a May evening in 1981, a 53-year-old man named Bobby Grant Lambert walked out of a Safeway grocery store in Houston and was shot dead in the parking lot. Within weeks, a 17-year-old named Gary Graham was in custody. He had been on a violent spree that week, at least 10 armed robberies and a sexual assault, and he admitted to all of it. But he swore, from the moment of his arrest to the moment the needle went in, that he did not kill Bobby Lambert. The entire capital murder case against Graham rested on a single eyewitness. Her name was Bernadine Skillern, and she told police she had seen the shooter's face through her car windshield at night from across a dimly lit parking lot for a matter of seconds. She picked Graham out of a lineup, and that single identification became the backbone of the prosecution's entire capital murder case. No fingerprints connected Graham to the scene. No ballistics report tied his weapon to the fatal round. In fact, supporters later pointed to a ballistics analysis that they argued actually excluded his gun from the crime altogether. And Skillern was not the only person who saw something that night. Several other eyewitnesses came forward and told investigators they had seen the shooter. The person they described did not resemble Gary Graham, but those witnesses were never called to testify. The jury never heard from them. Graham's defense attorney at trial presented no case whatsoever during the penalty phase, called 0 witnesses on his behalf, and offered the jury nothing to weigh against a sentence of death. The trial moved fast. Graham was convicted in October 1981 and sent to Texas death row while he was still a teenager. He would spend the next 19 years on death row, maintaining his innocence every single day. In 1995, he legally changed his name to Shaka Sankofa, a name drawn from African heritage and the Zulu king Shaka. The NOOACP Legal Defense Fund picked up his cause and began pushing for a new trial, citing the uncalled witnesses and the contested ballistics. The case reached the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, where a panel actually vacated his death sentence. It looked briefly like Graham might get a second chance. Then the full court reheard the case and reinstated the sentence. His legal team also brought the case before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, arguing that international law imposed an absolute prohibition on executing offenders who were under 18 at the time of their crime. The commission agreed and later issued a formal finding that the United States had violated that norm. But the ruling carried no enforcement power in American courts. It changed nothing on the ground in Texas, where Graham's execution date was already set. On June 22, 2000, the state of Texas executed Gary Graham by lethal injection. He did not go quietly. A 5-member cell extraction team had to physically remove him from his cell, carry him to the death chamber, and strap him to the gurney while he fought them. Outside the Walls unit in Huntsville, protesters had gathered in large numbers. Inside, among the witnesses, stood Bianca Jagger, Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Reverend Al Sharpton, all there on Graham's behalf. In his final moments, Graham called his execution a legal lynching and an act of genocide in America. He told the room he did not kill Bobby Lambert and swore the truth would eventually come out. He was pronounced dead at 8:49 in the evening. He was 36 years old, and he had been on death row since he was a teenager. His execution became one of the most heavily protested in modern American history and a flashpoint in the 2000 presidential campaign. The governor who had presided over the Texas death penalty system during Graham's final years on the row was George W. Bush, then running for the White House. The question Graham's supporters had raised for 19 years followed his case from the courtroom to the national stage and never went away. whether one eyewitness identification, made in a dark parking lot for a handful of seconds, should have been enough to sentence a 17-year-old boy to death and keep him there until the state killed him. Graham was far from the only teenager Texas strapped to that gurney. And the case that came 2 years later was, in some ways, even more tangled. Napoleon Beasley. Napoleon Beasley was born on August 5, 1976. He was 17 years old, roughly 3.5 months short of his 18th birthday, when he and 2 accomplices drove to a house in Tyler, Texas, looking to steal a car. On April 19, 1994, they found what they wanted parked in the garage of a 63-year-old businessman named John Luttig. When Luttig came home and walked into his own garage to find 3 teenagers attempting to take his car, Beasley shot him twice in the head. He also fired at Luttig's wife, Bobby, but missed. She survived by collapsing to the ground and playing dead while the 3 teenagers fled in the stolen Mercedes-Benz. Beasley was arrested and tried in Smith County. The jury that convicted him was all white. His 2 accomplices, brothers Cedric and Donald Coleman, turned against him and testified for the prosecution in exchange for life sentences. Beasley was sentenced to death on March 17, 1995. He had turned 18 by the time the sentence was handed down. The crime that put him on death row had happened while he was still in high school, 3.5 months before the birthday that would have made it legally impossible to execute him under most proposals then circulating in the legal world. What made this case deeply unusual beyond the age of the defendant was a detail that infected every level of the appeals process. The victim's son, J. Michael Luttig, was one of the most prominent conservative federal appeals judges in the country. He had close professional ties to multiple Supreme Court justices and was widely considered a potential nominee to the court himself. When Beasley's case reached the Supreme Court, 3 justices, Scalia, Thomas, and Souter, recused themselves because of their relationships with the younger Luttig. That left 6 justices to decide whether to grant a stay of execution, and on August 13, 2001, they deadlocked 3-3. Under the court's rules, a tie meant the stay was denied. Half the participating justices thought the execution should be paused, and it moved forward anyway. Beasley's lawyers raised documented evidence of racial bias in the jury selection process, pointing to the all-white composition of the panel that sentenced him. They also argued the same thing defense attorneys across the country were beginning to press in juvenile capital cases: that a 17-year-old brain is physically incapable of the same judgment and impulse control as an adult brain, that the prefrontal cortex is still years from full development at that age, and that executing a teenager for decisions made with a still-forming mind violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The court, on the day of execution, rejected his final habeas petition unanimously. The opposition to his execution reached a scale that few American death penalty cases had ever seen. The European Union issued a formal diplomatic protest. The American Bar Association called for a blanket moratorium on executing juvenile offenders nationwide. Amnesty International made his case a priority campaign. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Nobel laureate, wrote a personal letter to the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles, telling them he was astounded that the state of Texas would take children from their families and put them to death. Beasley's sister, Maria, spoke publicly about the person her brother had become on death row, describing him as deeply remorseful and genuinely rehabilitated, someone who bore no resemblance to the 17-year-old who committed that carjacking in Tyler. None of it was enough. On May 28, 2002, Napoleon Beasley was executed by lethal injection. He was 25 years old. He left behind a written final statement, one that would be quoted in legal arguments for years. In it, he said the world was being told that night that there were no second chances in the eyes of justice. He called the act he committed not just heinous, but senseless. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked for understanding of what it means to execute someone for something they did as a child. And somehow, it gets worse. Because while the international community rallied around Beasley's case, the legal precedent that made his execution possible had already claimed its first juvenile life 12 years earlier in a case out of Louisiana that carried an overwhelming pile of reasons not to proceed. Dalton Prejean. On July 2, 1977, a Louisiana state trooper named Donald Cleveland pulled over a car on a routine traffic stop outside Lafayette. While the trooper was holding one of the passengers against the side of the vehicle, a 17-year-old sitting in the back seat, Dalton Prejean, pulled out a gun and shot him in the face and chest. Trooper Cleveland died at the scene. He left behind a family and a department that would spend the next 13 years pushing for the death penalty. This was not Prejean's first killing. At the age of 14, he had shot and killed a taxi driver named John Doucet. He was adjudicated as a juvenile and sent to a detention facility. A psychiatric evaluation conducted at the time found him to be intellectually limited, with extremely poor judgment and a near-total inability to control his impulses. The evaluator recommended lengthy confinement. Despite that recommendation, the juvenile system released him back onto the streets. Roughly 6 months after Prejean walked out, a Louisiana state trooper was dead at his hands. Prejean's mental capacity became the central battleground in every appeal that followed. His defense attorneys argued he was borderline intellectually disabled, that brain damage sustained in early childhood had permanently impaired his cognitive development. Evaluations retained by the defense concluded he was functioning at the intellectual level of a 13-year-old. His IQ, as measured by defense-retained psychiatrists, was consistent with significant cognitive impairment. Reviewing courts ultimately rejected the formal intellectual disability claims, but no one on either side seriously disputed that Prejean was a profoundly limited individual. The only question was whether those limitations, documented since he was a child, mattered enough to keep the state from killing him. In 1989, the United States Supreme Court handed down Stanford versus Kentucky, a landmark decision that upheld the constitutionality of executing offenders who were 16 or 17 at the time of their crime. The ruling essentially told every state with a juvenile on death row that the Constitution did not stand in the way. That door was now open, and Dalton Prejean was the first person pushed through it. He became the first juvenile offender executed in the United States after Stanford was decided. The Louisiana Board of Pardons and Paroles had voted 3-2 to recommend that his sentence be commuted to life in prison. Governor Buddy Roemer refused. The governor stated that on behalf of 780 state troopers and thousands of police officers who risk their lives every day, the execution would go forward. The European Parliament formally called for commutation. An Amnesty International representative went further, calling the case extraordinary and saying that in documented recent world history, he doubted there had ever been an execution with such an overwhelming pile of reasons not to carry it out. Consider what the courts had in front of them: a teenager with documented brain damage from childhood, a prior killing committed at age 14, a juvenile system that knew he was dangerous, wrote down that he was dangerous, and released him anyway. An IQ that placed his mental functioning in the range of a middle schooler. Every one of those facts was entered into the record, argued by competent counsel, and presented to every reviewing court. Every one of them was deemed insufficient to stop the execution. On May 18, 1990, Dalton Prejean was put to death in the electric chair at Angola, Louisiana State Penitentiary, at 12:17 in the morning. He was 30 years old. In his final words, he said simply that he forfeited his life and gave his love to all. He was the first and last juvenile offender Louisiana had put to death since 1948, a gap of more than 4 decades. You would think someone would have said something, that the trajectory from a disturbed 14-year-old killer to a psychiatric evaluation that warned exactly what would happen, to a premature release to a dead state trooper, to the electric chair would have prompted a harder look at every failure along the way. Nobody did. Prejean was 17 when he committed the murder that sent him to death row. The next case on this list involves someone even younger. He was 16 years old for every one of his killings, and his is the only case of its kind in modern American history. Sean Sellers. On September 8, 1985, a 16-year-old named Sean Sellers walked into a Circle K convenience store in Oklahoma City and shot the clerk behind the counter. The victim was Robert Paul Bauer, 36 years old. An accomplice later told investigators that Sellers had said he wanted to know what it felt like to kill somebody. 6 months later, on March 5, 1986, Sellers crept into his parents' bedroom while they were asleep. He shot his mother, Vonda Belafato, and his stepfather, Lee Belafato, as they lay in bed. Vonda was 32 and Lee was 43. This was not a sudden act. Sellers had already attempted to kill his mother once before by putting rat poison in her food. When the poison failed, he came back with a firearm. He was 16 years old for all 3 killings. Every victim, every trigger pull, committed before his 17th birthday. 3 people dead in 6 months, and the person responsible was still, by every legal and biological measure, a child. At trial, Sellers mounted a defense built entirely on the occult. He claimed Satanism had consumed his mind and that a demon he called Ezurate had taken control of his actions. His attorneys argued that an obsessive addiction to Dungeons and Dragons had distorted his grip on reality until he could no longer tell the difference between a game and real life. The jury rejected every word of it. He was convicted in 1986 and sentenced to death. The state of Oklahoma was preparing to execute a 16-year-old's crimes. Years later, during the appeals process, a clinical evaluation produced a diagnosis that reframed the entire case. Sellers was found to have what was then called multiple personality disorder, now recognized as dissociative identity disorder. His legal team argued this diagnosis should have been presented at trial, that it explained his behavior in a way the Satanism defense never could, and that it might have changed the outcome. But the appellate courts pointed to a damning structural failure. His original court-appointed public defender had been allotted a total of $750 for all expert witness costs combined. That budget was so thin it barely covered a single evaluation, let alone the kind of comprehensive psychiatric workup that a triple murder case involving a 16-year-old defendant clearly demanded. In prison, Sellers transformed. He converted to evangelical Christianity, renounced the occult entirely, and wrote a book warning others about the dangers of Satanism. He became a global cause, not for what he had done, but for the question his case raised: whether the United States should execute a person for crimes committed at the age of 16. That question had a clear answer in the numbers. Sean Sellers was the only person put to death in the modern era of American capital punishment for a crime committed at 16. That is not a typo, by the way. Every other juvenile offender executed since the country resumed executions in 1977 had been at least 17 at the time of the crime. Sellers alone stood at 16. The last time the United States had executed someone that young was Leonard Shockley in Maryland, in 1959, 40 years earlier. On February 4, 1999, Oklahoma executed Sean Sellers by lethal injection at 12:17 in the morning. Before the drugs were administered, he sang Christian hymns inside the death chamber. He told those gathered in the witness room to reach out to God, that He would heal them. He asked people not to spend their lives carrying hatred. He said he loved everyone present. His final words, just before the chemicals entered his bloodstream, were that he was coming home. He was 29 years old. He had spent nearly half his life on death row for crimes he committed as a high school sophomore. Sellers's execution sat squarely within a legal question the Supreme Court would not fully resolve for another 6 years. In 2005, the court handed down Roper v. Simmons, which drew the constitutional line and declared that the Eighth Amendment categorically forbids executing anyone for a crime committed before the age of 18. That 5-4 ruling immediately spared 72 people sitting on death rows across 12 states. Had it come 6 years earlier, Sean Sellers would have been one of them. But before Roper, Texas still had unfinished business, and the next case involved a teenager who killed 3 members of his own family over something worth less than a used car. Toronto Patterson. On June 6, 1995, in a neighborhood in East Dallas, a 17-year-old named Toronto Patterson walked over to the home of his 25-year-old cousin, Kimberly Brewer. She lived there with her 2 daughters, 6-year-old Ollie and 3-year-old Jennifer, whom the family called Gigi. Patterson was not there for a visit. He was there for a set of custom chrome and gold BMW wheel rims sitting outside the house, valued at roughly $2,000. What happened next was laid bare in the trial record. Patterson shot and killed Kimberly Brewer. Both of her young daughters, Ollie and Gigi, also lost their lives that day. The full scope of what took place inside that home was described in court filings as deliberate and premeditated. What investigators found when they arrived was staggering. A 25-year-old mother and her 2 small children, the youngest barely old enough to speak in full sentences, all dead. The motive, as prosecutors established at trial, was a set of aftermarket car rims. The evidence was overwhelming and came from multiple directions. Patterson's fingerprints were lifted from the stolen wheel rims. The blood of the victims was found on his clothing, and in a detail that would prove damning at trial, Patterson was captured on local television news footage returning to the crime scene after the killings. Patterson claimed his confession had been coerced by police, but between the forensic evidence, the television footage, and the blood on his clothing, the jury had very little reason for doubt. He was convicted on November 21, 1995, and sentenced to death for the capital murder of a child under 6. Patterson's attorney, J. Gary Hart, took the case to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, filing the same kind of petition that had been submitted in Gary Graham's case years earlier. The core argument was that a binding norm of international law, known as jus cogens, prohibited executing anyone for a crime committed before the age of 18. The Commission agreed and formally requested that the United States stay the execution. The United States ignored the request entirely. The Commission later issued a finding that the execution constituted a violation of international human rights standards. That finding, like the one in Graham's case, carried no enforcement power in American courts. It was noted, filed, and set aside while the execution date held firm. At the state level, Patterson's chances were even thinner. The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles voted 16-1 against clemency and 17-0 against granting even a temporary reprieve. His appellate lawyers pressed the same neurological argument that defense teams had been constructing across the country in juvenile capital cases, that the brain of a 17-year-old is physically not yet finished developing, that the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for impulse control, long-range planning, and understanding the consequences of one's actions, is still actively being built at that age. They argued that executing someone for choices made with a biologically incomplete brain was a direct violation of the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The United States Supreme Court denied relief in a 6-3 decision. On August 28, 2002, Toronto Patterson was executed by lethal injection at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was pronounced dead at 6:20 in the evening. He was 24 years old. In his final statement, he told the room he felt an enormous weight of responsibility and guilt. He said he should be punished for his crime, but that he did not believe he should die for it. He said he was sorry, but acknowledged that nothing could ever bring Kimberly, Ollie, and Gigi back. To restate what the jury found, 3 members of one family, a mother and both of her daughters, were dead because a 17-year-old wanted a set of car rims worth $2,000. 2 of the victims had not yet started first grade. The ACLU and the American Bar Association both formally opposed the execution. But by 2002, the pattern in Texas was well established. 6 of the 22 juvenile offenders executed in the modern era came out of Texas, more than any other state. Justice Anthony Kennedy would later note in the Roper majority opinion that in the 10 years before that ruling, only 3 states had carried out such executions: Oklahoma, Texas, and Virginia. If you're watching this and you haven't subscribed yet, consider doing it now. It helps grow the channel, and you won't miss what comes next. Curtis Paul Harris. On December 11, 1978, a 27-year-old Texas A&M University employee named Timothy Merca was driving along Sandy Point Road in Brazos County when he spotted a car broken down on the shoulder. 2 young men were standing beside it, flagging for help. Merca pulled over and got out. He was the kind of person who stopped for strangers. That decision cost him his life. The car was stolen. The 2 men standing beside it were brothers, Curtis Paul Harris, 17 years old, and Danny Ray Harris, 18. A third accomplice, James Manuel, was also present. When Merca approached, Danny grabbed him and held him down on the ground. Curtis picked up an automobile jack and beat Timothy Merca to death with it, striking him approximately 15 times. They took his truck, his shotgun, and drove to a nearby convenience store, where they robbed the register and stole a donation jar that belonged to the Multiple Sclerosis Society. A 4th person connected to the group, a 16-year-old named Valerie Renscher, later turned state's evidence and testified against the brothers. Curtis Harris was convicted and sentenced to death. The case was not clean. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals reversed his conviction on the grounds that the trial court had improperly restricted the defense's ability to cross-examine a key witness. The state retried him after a venue change to Montgomery County, and a second jury sentenced him to death again. That jury, like the first, was all white. His attorneys brought the case to the United States Supreme Court, arguing that Harris's brain had been damaged by a severe beating administered by his father during childhood, that the all-white jury had been selected through a racially biased process, and that executing him violated the Constitution. The Supreme Court declined to hear it. The structural problem went deeper than any single jury. Under the Texas capital sentencing statute in effect before 1991, jurors were not allowed to weigh a defendant's youth as a mitigating factor when deciding between life and death. The law gave them no mechanism to do so. That meant the jury that sentenced Curtis Harris literally could not consider the fact that he was 17 years old when he killed Timothy Merca. His age was irrelevant as a matter of law in the only proceeding that could have saved his life. Amnesty International documented the case extensively and cited an IQ score of 77, a figure that placed him in the borderline range of intellectual functioning. His lawyers argued that the combination of documented brain damage, low cognitive ability, and a childhood defined by violence from his own father should have been enough to spare his life. Every court that reviewed the argument disagreed. It was not. On July 1, 1993, the state of Texas executed Curtis Paul Harris by lethal injection at 12:27 in the morning. He was 31 years old. When offered the chance to speak his final words, he declined. He said nothing at all. 4 weeks later, on July 30, 1993, the state executed his older brother Danny Ray Harris for the same murder. It was one of only 6 times in Texas history that the state has executed siblings. The 2 brothers who pulled over Timothy Merca on Sandy Point Road were put to death within a single month of each other. James Manuel, the 3rd man at the scene, received a 25-year prison sentence. Valerie Rencher, who was 16 at the time of the crime, cooperated with prosecutors and avoided prosecution. Curtis Harris's execution came during a cluster of Texas juvenile offender cases in the early 1990s that prompted Amnesty International to publish a report specifically titled Texas Executing Juvenile Offenders. The report placed Harris alongside Gary Graham, Reuben Cantu, and others as evidence that Texas was carrying out a disproportionate share of the nation's juvenile executions. A Good Samaritan had stopped to help 2 strangers on a dark road, and 2 brothers went to the death chamber for killing him. Curtis was 17, Danny was 18, and the jury that decided Curtis should die was never permitted, under Texas law, to treat his age as a reason to let him live. The Harris brothers were not the only teenagers in Texas whose mental capacity became a central and ultimately losing argument on appeal. The case that followed Harris through the system involved a defendant whose brain damage was even more extensively documented and whose trial was even harder to defend. Robert Anthony Carter. On June 24, 1981, a young woman named Sylvia Reyes was working the register at a Conoco gas station on South Wayside Drive in Houston. She was 18 years old and managed the station. A teenager walked in, pulled a .38 caliber revolver, and shot her once in the chest while she tried to stop him from taking roughly $150 out of the register. Sylvia Reyes died from that single gunshot wound. The teenager who killed her was Robert Anthony Carter. He was 16 or 17 years old at the time, depending on which record you consult. His own testimony at trial placed his date of birth on September 10, 1964, which would have made him 16 years and 9 months old. Amnesty International described him as 17. He was without question a juvenile with no prior criminal record, but investigators also linked him to the killing of R.B. Scott, a 63-year-old man shot during a robbery at a beauty supply store 6 days earlier on June 18th. Carter was tried for the murder of Sylvia Reyes and sentenced to death on March 10, 1982. The jury deliberated on his punishment for approximately 10 minutes. And no, I am not making that up. 10 minutes to decide whether a teenager should live or die. His court-appointed attorneys did almost nothing to build a defense. They failed to investigate his background. They failed to examine his mental health history. They made remarks during the trial that were openly prejudicial to their own client, a level of incompetence that would later form the basis of an ineffective assistance of counsel claim on appeal. Carter, while being held in isolation with no access to legal guidance, waived his right to counsel and gave a full confession to investigators. He was a teenager with no criminal record, no experience with the legal system, and no understanding of what he was agreeing to, sitting alone in a room and signing away his life. The depth of what his trial lawyers missed only became clear years later. Dr. Dorothy Lewis, a forensic psychiatrist at the New York University School of Medicine, examined Carter and found him to be significantly intellectually impaired, with a full-scale IQ of 74. She also found evidence of serious, lasting brain damage. The origins of that damage told their own story. As a young child, Carter had been struck in the head with a brick at the age of 5. At 10, he was hit in the head with a baseball bat. And shortly before the crime that sent him to death row, his own brother shot him in the head. The bullet wound was still healing when he walked into that Conoco station. The childhood violence, the repeated head trauma, the documented cognitive impairment, none of it was presented to the jury because his lawyers never looked for it. They never hired an investigator. They never retained a psychiatrist. They never asked the questions that might have saved his life. His appeals wound through the Texas and federal courts for 16 years. In Carter v. State, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed his conviction and death sentence. In Carter v. Johnson, the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals rejected his claims of ineffective assistance of counsel and his argument that an impostor may have testified against him, and denied all relief. Amnesty International made Robert Anthony Carter a flagship case in its global campaign against the juvenile death penalty, holding up the 10-minute jury deliberation as a symbol of everything broken about how the United States was sentencing teenagers to die. On May 18, 1998, the state of Texas executed Robert Anthony Carter by lethal injection. He was 33 years old. In his final moments, he told the witnesses he loved them. He said he hoped the family of his victim would forgive him because he never meant to hurt anyone. A teenager with documented brain damage, an IQ in the 70s, and lawyers who never bothered to look into any of it. A jury that spent 10 minutes deciding he should die, and a legal system that took 16 years to review the case and concluded at every level that nothing had gone wrong. Carter's execution came in 1998, but the youngest person Texas put to death in the modern era had already been executed 12 years before that, in a case so brutal that the governor who signed off on it called the crimes two of the most heinous acts he had ever seen. J. Kelly Pinkerton. On October 26, 1979, in Amarillo, Texas, a 17-year-old named J. Kelly Pinkerton broke into the home of a woman named Sarah Dawn Lawrence while her young children slept in a room nearby. What he did to her inside that house was extreme, even by the standards of capital murder cases in Texas. He raped her, stabbed her more than 30 times, and mutilated her body. She was found dead in her home. Less than 6 months later, on April 9, 1980, Pinkerton walked into an Amarillo furniture store where 25-year-old Sherry Lynn Welch was working. Welch was a former beauty queen, a young woman known in the community. Pinkerton raped and stabbed her to death inside the store during business hours. Forensic investigators recovered a bloody palm print from the Lawrence home that matched Pinkerton, and bite mark evidence from the Welch crime scene tied him directly to the second murder. 2 separate killings, both involving sexual assault, both involving a knife, committed by the same 17-year-old within a span of roughly 5 months. Pinkerton was arrested, and the state of Texas pursued the death penalty for both murders in separate proceedings. He was first tried for the killing of Sarah Lawrence after the defense obtained a venue change that moved the trial to Corpus Christi, more than 500 miles south of Amarillo. The jury there heard the forensic evidence, the palm print, the circumstances of the attack, and the fact that the victim's children had been asleep in the next room while it happened. They sentenced him to death on May 30th, 1981. A second trial, held in El Paso for the murder of Sherry Welch, produced a second death sentence. He was 18 years old by the time both sentences were imposed, but both crimes had been committed when he was 17. Two separate juries, two separate courthouses, two separate death sentences, all for acts committed before his 18th birthday. What followed was a prolonged and tortured appeals process, in which Pinkerton came closer to surviving than almost anyone on this list. He escaped 3 separate execution dates over the course of several years. On one occasion, a stay of execution arrived with just 25 minutes remaining before the scheduled injection. 25 minutes. Each time he was pulled back from the edge, and each time the state of Texas reset the clock and moved to execute him again. Governor Mark White refused every appeal for clemency. The governor told the press that the crimes J. Pinkerton committed were 2 of the most brutal and heinous acts imaginable, and that he saw no basis for intervention. While on death row, Pinkerton converted to Islam. He spent his remaining years observing his faith inside a cell at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas, praying toward Mecca and waiting for the execution date that would finally hold. By the time it came, he had been on death row for 5 years. On May 15, 1986, the state of Texas executed J. Kelly Pinkerton by lethal injection. He was 24 years old. In his final moments, he turned to his father, Gene Pinkerton, who stood among the witnesses. He told his father to be strong for him. He said he wanted him to know he was at peace with himself and with his God. He asked his father to say goodbye to his mother. After reciting a Muslim prayer, his very last words were that he felt dizziness. He said it twice. Then the drugs took him. J. Kelly Pinkerton was the youngest person executed in the United States since the Supreme Court permitted the death penalty to resume in 1976, and only the 3rd juvenile offender put to death in the modern era. He was 17 when he committed 2 acts of such extreme violence that 2 juries and a governor concluded no punishment short of death was sufficient. He was 24 when the state made that judgment permanent. Pinkerton was the 3rd juvenile offender executed. By the time the legal system was finished, there would be 22. The very last name on that list belonged to a young man in Oklahoma whose crime was so extreme that even his own attempts at remorse were undercut by his unwillingness to accept full responsibility. His execution ended the practice for good, just 2 years before the Supreme Court made it unconstitutional. Scott Hayne. On October 6, 1987, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, a 17-year-old named Scott Hayne and his accomplice Robert Lambert approached 2 young co-workers in a parking lot and carjacked them at gunpoint. The victims were Michael William Houghton, 27 years old, and Laura Lee Sanders, 22. Hayne and Lambert robbed them of roughly $565. Then they forced both victims into the trunk of the car, drove to a remote location outside the city, and set the vehicle on fire with Houghton and Sanders still locked inside. Both victims burned to death in the trunk of their own car. The robbery netted barely enough to cover a week of groceries. 2 people were burned alive for it. $565, split between 2 killers for 2 human lives. Hayne was convicted in 1988 and sentenced to death. The conviction held on appeal, but the sentencing did not survive its first round of review. A reviewing court found that the original jury had never been informed that life without the possibility of parole was available as a sentencing option. That was a critical omission. It meant the jurors had been forced to choose between death and a sentence that might someday have returned Hain to the streets, without ever knowing there was a middle option that kept him locked away permanently. Hain was resentenced in 1994. The second jury, this time fully informed that life without parole was on the table, deliberated and chose death again. His co-defendant, Robert Lambert, also received a death sentence. But Lambert's story diverged sharply from Hain's in the years that followed. In 2002, the Supreme Court ruled in Atkins v. Virginia that executing intellectually disabled individuals violated the Eighth Amendment. Following that landmark ruling, Lambert was evaluated, found to meet the clinical criteria for intellectual disability, and had his death sentence commuted to life in prison in 2005. He is alive today. Scott Hain, whose legal team was unable to establish a comparable disability finding under the Atkins standard, received no such relief. Two men involved in the same crime, the same victims, the same car, and one of them lived because of a diagnosis the other could not obtain. The legal battle over Hain's execution became the final act in a constitutional argument that had been building for 2 decades. In February of 2003, the United States Supreme Court vacated a stay of execution that the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals had issued on Hain's behalf. On the night of the execution itself, the justices split 5-4 over whether to halt it. 4 justices believed the execution of a juvenile offender was unconstitutional. 5 disagreed. That single vote was the margin between life and death for Scott Hain, and it foreshadowed the exact division the court would confront 2 years later in Roper v. Simmons, when it finally ruled, 5-4, that executing anyone for a crime committed before the age of 18 violated the Constitution. At his clemency hearing, Hain had apologized to the families of Michael Houghton and Laura Sanders. He expressed remorse, but he also attempted to shift the primary blame onto Lambert, an argument that did not land well with the board or with anyone watching. On April 3, 2003, the state of Oklahoma executed Scott Hain by lethal injection. He was pronounced dead at 8:39 in the evening. He was 32 years old. He declined to make a final statement. Scott Hain was the last juvenile offender executed in the United States. He was the 22nd since executions resumed in 1977, and the final name on a list that the Supreme Court would permanently close 23 months later. Had Roper been decided before Hain's execution date, he would still be alive today. So would 71 other people then sitting on death rows across 12 states, all of whom were spared by the same 5-4 ruling that came too late for Hain. But the story of juvenile executions in the modern era did not begin with the last name on the list. It began 17 years earlier, with a young man in South Carolina whose case drew opposition from a sitting United Nations Secretary General, a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and a former President of the United States. James Terry Roach. In October of 1977, near Columbia, South Carolina, a 17-year-old named James Terry Roach climbed into a car with 2 other men. One was Joseph Carl Shaw, 22 years old. The other was Ronald Mahaffey. What the 3 of them did over the next several hours would become one of the most heavily cited cases in the international campaign to abolish the juvenile death penalty. They drove to a baseball field where they found Thomas Taylor, a 17-year-old boy. Taylor was fatally harmed at the scene. The group then abducted Taylor's girlfriend, 14-year-old Carlotta Hartness. She was subjected to prolonged and repeated assault over the course of the night. Her life was taken. Roach also entered a plea in connection with the earlier killing of a woman named Betty Swank. The scope of the violence attributed to the group was staggering, and the youngest victim was 14 years old. Roach pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to death. Shaw, the oldest of the three at 22, was executed on January 11, 1985. Mahaffey, the third participant, cooperated with prosecutors, turned state's witness, and received a life sentence in exchange for his testimony. The defense presented evidence that Roach was borderline intellectually disabled and argued that he had inherited Huntington's disease, a progressive and degenerative neurological condition that attacks the brain and body over time. The defense contended that the disease, even in its early stages, could have impaired Roach's judgment, his impulse control, and his capacity to fully understand the consequences of his actions. The question of whether his condition rendered him legally incompetent reached the United States Supreme Court in Roach v. Aiken. During the same term, the court was considering the landmark competency case Ford v. Wainwright. Justices William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall dissented from the court's decision to deny a stay of execution, but the majority allowed the scheduled date to stand. What truly set the Roach case apart from every other juvenile execution of the era was the extraordinary scale of the international opposition. United Nations Secretary-General Javier Pérez de Cuellar personally appealed for clemency. The Secretary-General of the Organization of American States, João Baena Suarez, did the same. Mother Teresa, the Nobel Peace Prize laureate, wrote to South Carolina on Roach's behalf, asking the state to spare his life. Former President Jimmy Carter also intervened, urging clemency. Governor Richard Riley considered all of it and refused. The prosecutor in the case, Jim Anders, addressed the public opposition directly. He told the press that when people were this mean and this cruel, there was simply no other way to deal with them. Roach's defense attorney, David Brooke, made one final appeal to the state's own history. He invoked the name of George Stinney, a 14-year-old black boy who had been executed by the state of South Carolina in 1944 in a trial that lasted less than a day. Stinney was so small that the straps of the electric chair could not be properly fitted to his body. The execution had haunted South Carolina's legal conscience for decades. Brooks' question to the court and to the governor was plain. Had the state learned anything at all in the 42 years since they strapped a child into that chair? On January 10, 1986, James Terry Roach was executed in the electric chair at the Central Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina. 2 separate jolts of electricity were required to complete the execution. He was pronounced dead at 5:16 in the morning. He was 25 years old. He was the second person executed in South Carolina in the modern era, and the first juvenile offender involuntarily put to death in the United States since 1964. A gap of more than 2 decades. In his final words, Roach spoke directly to the families of the victims. He told them his heart was still with them in their sorrow and asked for their forgiveness, saying he believed his Lord had already forgiven him. He turned to his own family and friends and said there were only 3 words left to say. I love you. James Terry Roach was the beginning, and Scott Hayne was the end. Between 1986 and 2003, 22 juvenile offenders were executed in the United States. Every single one of those executions would be unconstitutional today. Those are the 10. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.